They said I was losing my mind. He said, "Let the neighbors watch her rot." That was my grandson, my only blood left under this roof, and the boy I once held against my chest while he screamed at the world for taking his father too soon. Now, he was the one tying me to a wooden chair in the middle of the yard, his hands steady, his jaw tight, his breath shaking from somewhere deep, like he didn't believe what he was doing, but was too proud to stop. The rope scratched my wrists, rough and practical, the kind you buy for garbage bins or moving furniture. He tied my ankles too, double knots, muttering, "You won't hurt yourself if you don't move." Hurt myself. I almost laughed. The sun was high, the air sticky, and the smell of cut grass mingled with the bitterness of my own sweat. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere else, a lawnmower started. The world kept turning. No one came. That's what they don't tell you about cruelty. It doesn't always happen in the dark. Sometimes it happens under clear daylight, while people hang laundry and pretend they don't see. My name is Ruth. I'm 72. I used to be a teacher. I live, or lived, in this small house at the edge of town, the one with the blue shutters and the pear tree that refuses to bloom since my husband died. I never remarried. I was too busy surviving grief, then too busy raising my son alone, then too busy saving his son from himself. And that's the irony. You save a child long enough, he learns to drown you with the same hands you used to lift him. My grandson's name is Evan, 24 years old, the kind of boy who once cried if a bird hit the window, but later forgot my birthday 3 years in a row. He came to live with me after my son's overdose. God, that word still cuts. And at first, I thought we would heal together. We didn't. He brought with him a shadow, quiet at first, then loud. Unemployment, debt, pills, the smell of smoke in his clothes. It wasn't violence at the beginning, not in the way people imagine it. It was slow corrosion, slammed doors, long silences, my name said like an accusation. That morning, the one that ended with rope burns and neighbors pretending blindness, started like any other. I made coffee too strong, set out 2 mugs, even though he rarely drank his anymore, and waited for the sound of his footsteps. He slept late, claimed the world gave him nothing worth waking up for. When he finally stumbled into the kitchen, he didn't look at me. He never did lately. His eyes were flat, phone-glazed, the way people look when reality's too dull to matter. "Rent's due," I said softly. He shrugged. "You'll cover it," he replied. I should have said no. I should have said 100 things. Instead, I rinsed the mug and said, "We'll figure it out." That's what I always said, the same way I said it to his father, the same way my mother said it to me when the lights were cut off and the landlord knocked. Women like us don't learn to refuse. We learn to soften, to negotiate, to make it easier for everyone but ourselves. When I went outside later to hang the laundry, he followed. He'd been pacing all morning, restless, whispering to himself, tapping his phone, the way addicts do when they're chasing ghosts through screens. He asked if I'd been talking to anyone lately, if I'd told the neighbors about his situation. I told him no, because I hadn't. I don't gossip. He didn't believe me. He never does. He said people were watching us, judging him. He said I made him look weak. His voice had that tremor I'd learned to fear, the one that meant the pills had worn off or the anger had kicked in. I told him to sit, that I'd make lunch, that we could talk. He smiled then, a strange, crooked smile I hadn't seen since he was little, except it wasn't innocent anymore. It was cold, practiced, almost kind. "You always talk," he said. "Maybe it's time you learned to listen." And before I could ask what he meant, he pushed the chair toward me. The one from the porch, old and splintered. Derek's chair, the one my husband used to nap in during summer. I sat down because that's what fear makes you do. It turns you obedient. The rope appeared from nowhere. Maybe he'd planned it. Maybe it had been sitting in the garage waiting for this moment. I didn't resist at first. My mind couldn't believe what my body already knew. When the first knot tightened, I whispered, "Evan, please." He said, "You'll thank me when this is over." That's when I understood. It wasn't rage. It was righteousness. He thought he was punishing me for something I couldn't name, for being old, for surviving, for reminding him of everything he lost. "Let the neighbors watch her rot," he muttered, and dragged the chair to the center of the yard like he was displaying art. At first, I waited for him to come back. I told myself it was a breakdown, that he'd return, untie me, cry, say he was sorry. But hours passed. The sun burned through my thin blouse. Sweat ran into my eyes. Flies gathered near my ankles. The rope cut deeper. I could feel my pulse beneath it, steady but smaller. The longer I sat, the more the world shrank to the circle of dirt around my chair and the endless noise of ordinary life happening without me. Children laughing next door, someone mowing their lawn, a radio playing old country songs. I wanted to shout, but shame sealed my throat. What if they believed I deserved it? What if they already did? I thought of all the ways people look away, polite, uneasy, self-protective, and realized that invisibility doesn't begin when people forget you. It begins when you start apologizing for being seen. I used to believe I was respected here. I taught half the children on this street to read. They used to bring me cookies at Christmas, little handmade cards with crooked letters. Now, they avoid my gaze at the grocery store. Aging is like turning into smoke. You're still in the room, but people breathe through you. So when I heard the screen door slam and the heavy footsteps leaving down the drive, I didn't scream. I just listened. The gravel crunched, then silence. He was gone. I was alone. The sun was starting to lower, and the air changed. That shift between heat and dusk that always made me think of my husband's last breath, how the light dimmed just the same way. I thought of Derek then, wondered if he would have believed this ending for me. Maybe he would have blamed himself. He always said he worried what grief would do to our boy, and by extension, to the boy's boy. Hours crawled. The chair creaked under my weight. My legs were numb, my mouth dry. I tried to remember water, its taste. I tried to count breaths, to keep my mind anchored. I thought about how a life folds in on itself, not with catastrophe, but with 1,000 small yeses to people who never earned them. Yes, I'll lend you money. Yes, I'll sign the paper. Yes, I'll understand. Until one day, you're tied to a chair under the open sky, and the same neighbors who once waved at you pretend their curtains don't move. That's when I started to laugh. Quiet at first, then shaking. Not madness, not quite. Just the absurdity of it all. If anyone had told me that my final lesson as a teacher would be about visibility, I'd have laughed sooner. When the sun sank, the yard turned gold, and the first chill crept in. I finally whispered to no one, "So this is what forgetting looks like." I didn't cry, not then. My tears had retired years ago, after funerals and birthdays that never came. Instead, I stared at the pear tree. It was bare, brittle, but still standing, like me. I thought, maybe that's enough for tonight, to still be standing, even when they try to make you rot. And somewhere deep inside that thought, a spark of anger lit up, quiet but alive. Not rage, not revenge, just the small, stubborn flame of someone who refuses to disappear. I didn't know yet that the night would bring sirens, that my humiliation would become breaking news, that justice sometimes wears a uniform. At that moment, I only knew one thing. The rope could hold my body, but not my story. Not anymore. That night changed shape when the sun disappeared behind the rooftops, and the world took on that bruised color between orange and gray, when daylight pretends it might last forever, but everything living already knows it won't. I sat in the chair, my wrists swollen, the rope damp from sweat, my body stiff from holding itself upright for too many hours. The neighbors' windows glowed faintly, soft rectangles of light where life went on without me. I could hear dishes clinking, the murmur of televisions, the steady hum of air conditioners fighting off the heat. I thought of knocking sounds, laughter, children asking for bedtime stories, and I wondered if any of them thought about the old woman sitting in her yard, tied to a chair. Maybe they saw me from the kitchen window and decided it wasn't their business. People like to say they mind their own, as if that's a virtue. It's just cowardice dressed as decency. The first mosquito bite broke the last illusion that this would end quickly. I slapped at it, my hand half numb, and realized how ridiculous the gesture was. I couldn't move enough to chase away insects, let alone the memory of my grandson's face as he walked away. He didn't look back once, and that detail hurt more than the rope or the heat. I had seen that same stubborn line of his jaw when he was 6, refusing to apologize after breaking a window with a baseball. His father used to laugh, saying, "He's got your will, Ma." I suppose he did, only stripped of tenderness, sharpened into something that cuts. I used to think will was a strength. Now I think it's a curse if no one teaches you mercy to go with it. I lost track of time. The moon rose like an indifferent coin above the trees, and the night brought a new kind of cruelty. Silence. Not peace, not rest, but the kind of silence that amplifies every creak of wood, every heartbeat, every whisper of thought you don't want to hear. I started talking to Derek, my husband, as if he were sitting beside me in his old work boots, leaning back with his arms crossed. I told him I was sorry for how things had turned out, that I'd failed our boy, that I'd failed the boy's boy. I told him that maybe I should have been stricter, that love doesn't always save, that sometimes it spoils and blinds. I remembered how Derek used to say I forgave too easily, how he worried I mistook endurance for virtue. He was right. Women in my family have been saints of survival, silent, patient, loyal beyond reason. Saints get forgotten first. When I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of our son's childhood, the way he used to run barefoot through the yard, how I'd shout after him not to climb the pear tree because the branches were too thin. The same tree stood now behind me, bare and crooked, its branches swaying like it remembered everything I wanted to forget. I thought about how grief changes shape with time. First it's heavy, then it's hollow, and if you don't look at it too closely, it becomes habit. After Derek died, I kept busy, filled the house with motion, with the noise of usefulness. When our son started slipping, late nights, strange calls, lost jobs, I told myself it was a phase. I kept saving him until there was nothing left to save. And when he died, I promised I'd do better with Evan. Promises are dangerous when you make them to ghosts. By midnight, my head had started to droop, my body folding under its own weight. I could see my reflection faintly in the kitchen window, a distorted outline through the glass, a small old woman tied to a chair, hair wild, skin streaked with dirt, eyes hollow but awake. I thought about how many women before me had sat waiting, for husbands who never came home from war, for sons who never called, for forgiveness that never arrived. Waiting is a tradition passed down like china plates. I swore I'd end it tonight. I just didn't know how. My arms were numb, my legs trembling from lack of blood, my voice hoarse. The rope was slick now. Maybe I could loosen it. I twisted my wrist, pain shooting up my arm, but the knot held fast. He'd done a thorough job. I wondered where he learned that. Scouts, maybe, or some cruel new friend who taught him practical tricks. Sometime past midnight, headlights swept across the yard. My heart jumped. A car slowed near the curb, idling for a moment, then moved on. For a second, I imagined a stranger stepping out, asking if I was all right, calling someone, helping me up. The car disappeared. I felt a strange mixture of relief and despair. What if they had stopped and found me like this? What would they have thought? That I was a victim or that I was a spectacle? Shame still mattered, even then. That was the worst part. I was still protecting him in my mind, still thinking about how this would look, how people might whisper about the poor boy who snapped, the crazy grandmother who provoked him. Generational loyalty is a slow poison. It keeps you still when you should scream. It was around 2 when I heard voices. At first I thought I was hallucinating, but then laughter drifted over the fence. 2 teenagers walking down the street, maybe coming back from a party. I tried to call out, but the sound that came was barely human, a rasp of dry air. One of them shone a flashlight toward my yard. "What the hell?" he said. They whispered, giggled nervously. The light lingered on me for a second, then disappeared. Their footsteps faded. I didn't blame them. It's easier to believe in ghosts than in cruelty that close to home. But what I didn't know then was that one of them recorded it, just for fun, a shaky video of the crazy old lady tied up outside her house. They'd post it online before dawn. That was how the world would find me, not through concern, but through ridicule. That's the way it goes now. Mercy only travels through spectacle. Around 4, the sky began to pale. My body had stopped shaking, which worried me more than the shivering had. Cold does that. It tricks you into thinking you're fine right before you're not. I thought I saw movement in the window. Maybe Evan had returned. My heart leapt and sank in the same breath. The kitchen light flicked on, then off. I couldn't be sure. I thought about how every abuser I'd ever known, even the subtle ones, always came back to the scene eventually, not out of guilt, but to see if their power still held. When the sirens came an hour later, faint and distant, I thought they were for someone else. I didn't even flinch. It wasn't until I saw the red and blue flashing against the windows that I understood. Someone had finally decided to care, and it probably wasn't love that moved them, just curiosity. The police car pulled up. I heard the doors slam, boots crunching on gravel. A woman's voice called out, "Ma'am, are you all right?" For a second I wanted to laugh. All right, what a phrase. I tried to answer, but my voice came out as a whisper. They rushed toward me. A flashlight blinded me, then the pressure of hands untying knots. The rope fell away. My arms dropped, heavy as stone. One of them knelt beside me. "Who did this to you?" he asked. I looked past him, toward the house. The back door was open, a faint light inside, movement maybe, or maybe just my own breath catching. I said nothing, not because I wanted to protect Evan anymore, but because I suddenly understood something sharp and terrible. This wasn't over. This was only the beginning. They helped me stand, wrapped a blanket around me, led me inside. The house felt foreign, like someone else's. Every photo on the wall was a lie. They sat me down at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd taught Evan to spell his name, where I'd baked him birthday cakes, where I'd once bandaged his scraped knees. "Do you have family we can call?" one of the officers asked. I almost said no. Then I remembered. He was my family. The word tasted like ash. They gave me water, called for medical assistance, took notes. I heard static on the radio, code numbers, bureaucratic compassion. And then the younger officer said it, casual as a weather report. We just got word. They're bringing in a suspect near the highway. Matches your description of the grandson. I hadn't given them a description. I hadn't said a word about him yet. My silence had its own language. When they left, the dawn had broken fully, and I sat in the kitchen wrapped in that blanket, watching the light spill across the linoleum like it didn't care what it revealed. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant murmur of the police radio. I thought about what would happen next. Interviews, reports, maybe pity on the evening news. And somewhere in a holding cell, Evan would be sitting with his head down, the world suddenly too real. I wanted to hate him, but what I felt was heavier and sadder than hate. It was recognition. The cycle had come full circle, the debt of pain passed down and multiplied. I realized then that forgiveness isn't a door you walk through. It's a wall you decide not to keep building. But I wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. I just sat there, breathing, feeling the pulse return to my wrists, and waited for whatever came next, knowing that survival was no longer just a habit. It was a reckoning. I used to think escalation arrived with sirens and shouting, with doors broken down and fists on tables, but I learned it prefers smaller rooms and softer voices. It likes the hush of polite concern and the way a person's name can be said as if it were a diagnosis. It likes paperwork and passwords and the subtle shift of who holds the keys. And in the weeks before the night that everyone saw, before the lights and the neighbors pretending shock into their phones, the ground under my life tilted so gradually I could not prove it moved, only that I felt dizzy and kept reaching for furniture that had been quietly rearranged when I wasn't looking. After the officers left that first dawn, after they took their notes and warned they might follow up, after they asked if I wished to press charges, and I stared at the word charges like it belonged to a world with better maps than mine, I told them I needed to rest, and they nodded with the sad efficiency of people who have seen too many versions of the same story and know that compassion is a limited resource. And when the house was empty again, I boiled water, held the steaming mug just to feel anything warm, and convinced myself that this was an episode, a fracture that would knit itself with time and quiet, because I have always believed in the cowardice of a certain kind of hope, the kind that excuses the present in exchange for a future that rarely arrives. Evan came home just after noon as if he had not left me there, his steps careful, his expression rehearsed, a performance of worry so shallow it barely rippled, and he spoke in the tone men adopt with women they are determined to trivialize, a syrup of apology and instruction, saying I had scared him, that I shouldn't wander outside at my age, that he had only tied the chair because I wouldn't sit still, and he needed to run an errand and feared I might fall. And though every syllable was an insult wrapped in bubble wrap, I let him talk, because in that moment it was easier to be misinterpreted than to be alone. And when he reached for my wrist to examine the rope burns, clucking like a nurse in a community theater play, I pulled away, not out of anger, but out of a sudden ache at the memory of how those same hands once cupped a jar of fireflies, as if the world depended on him holding their light. He took my phone to update it, disappearing down the hall with the casual theft of someone who thinks he is a natural extension of me, returned it with the brightness lowered and the emergency contacts quietly edited, and when I said I would like to visit the bank, He smiled an agreeable smile and offered to go for me because it was hot and my legs swelled in the afternoons. And wasn't it nice to have help? And I found myself saying yes while hating myself for the word, because consent delivered under the pressure of fatigue and gratitude is not consent. It is erosion. And erosion can look like hospitality if you squint. He started calling me Ruthie, the way strangers do when they want to leapfrog intimacy and land directly in ownership. Started leaving doors half locked so I would hesitate to step outside. Started turning the volume down on the doorbell until I stopped hearing it. Started moving my pills out of their weekly box into a jar so it looks nicer, which meant I had to ask him to count what already belonged to my body. Started introducing me to delivery men as my grandmother who gets confused sometimes, which was untrue and comprehensively damaging. And when I told him not to say that, he lifted both hands, palms out, and said he was only preparing people in case something happened. Because when you live with an older person, you are always a moment away from tragedy, and wasn't I always the one telling him to be responsible? He began to rewrite our household into a series of favors he granted, and I repaid with silence. The house a ledger, he updated aloud. The Wi-Fi is under my name now. The utilities are streamlined. The mailbox is overflowing, so I'll pick up your letters. The pear tree is dying, so don't waste water on it. The shed is unsafe. So I've put a padlock. The neighbor asked about you, and I told them you were resting. And do you see, Ruthie, how lucky you are to have me? Do you see how much I carry? And I wondered when exactly the switch flipped from carrying to carting, when love turned into harness, and whether I had trained him to see me as a burden by making him the sun that warmed every room, because women my age know how to construct altars to descendants, and then kneel on floors we mopped ourselves. This is the part that embarrasses me, not the rope or the yard or the neighbors who filmed and did not knock, but the meetings with people who wore badges on lanyards and the home visit from a woman with compassionate eyebrows who asked if I felt safe and wrote mixed on her form. The afternoon the pharmacist mentioned that my refill had been picked up already, and I realized my signature had been replaced by a scrawl that looked like defeat. The morning I tried my ATM card, and the machine blinked insufficient at an account I had never let sink before, the way I became too tired to call the bank immediately because I had taught myself to ration stamina like butter, and how, when I finally called and waded through the labyrinth of pre-recorded concern, the man on the other end asked if I had authorized a new user, and I heard myself say maybe, because in this house, maybe had become the bandage I wrapped around every cut that bled shame. Evan apologized beautifully when confronted with facts. He could build a bridge out of apologies and walk me back to the same cliff. And each time he promised to fix what he had quietly undone. Each time I watched him click and type and restore and reset. Each time I knew that the fix was only a pause between chapters of the same book, and I still let it happen because I did not yet recognize that escalation can be a rhythm, not a crescendo. The neighbors adjusted their gaze, the way communities learn to perform allegiance to the image of peace, their smiles growing firmer while their eyes slid away. And the woman 2 doors down who once brought me pie when I sprained my ankle began waving from the porch instead of crossing the grass. And when I ran into the retired mailman at the market, he said he'd heard I wasn't feeling myself and to take it easy. And I understood that Evan had been out sowing the seeds of a gentle narrative in which he was the caretaker and I the unpredictable weather, a forecast you could plan around but never fully trust. And this story made him a hero who deserved patience, and me a subject of concern. And concern is a padded room when it arrives without listening. He began suggesting I get some sun in the afternoons because it would lift my mood. And on mild days, he carried Derek's old chair to the yard and set it where the shade would arrive eventually, and he would stand with his hands on my shoulders as if blessing me and say he wanted the neighbors to see how well I was doing, as if recovery were something that could be projected onto a screen door. And I sat there because I have sat for others all my life, waiting with them through storms and court dates and hospital corridors. And what is one more sitting when you are built of benches? He stopped taking his shoes off at the door the way I'd taught him when he was 6 and tracking mud. He started letting the television drone overnight to keep me from hearing the late calls and the strange laughter. He started referring to the car as ours and then mine. He started rearranging photographs so that Derek's face moved farther down the hallway. And one morning, I found my wedding picture tucked behind a stack of pizza menus, and I put it back without comment, because sometimes you test the depth of a cut by ignoring it and seeing how long the bleeding continues. And that is how you learn that ignoring is not anesthesia, it is study. He brought flowers twice, supermarket daisies, set them in a glass, and told me I brightened the house. And an hour later, he asked if I could sign something small because he was trying to consolidate bills. And when I refused, he sighed theatrically, the way addicts exhale morality, and went quiet for a day, an absence that sits on your chest heavier than any argument. And when he reappeared, he was tender, and I felt relief. And relief is the most dangerous drug because it trains you to endure pain in exchange for the promise of its removal. The day before the night he dragged me into the center of my own lawn. He paused by the back door and asked if I remembered when he was little, and we used to make tents out of sheets. And I smiled because the body is a jukebox of tenderness and will play the requested song even when the bar is closing. And he laughed and said we were a funny pair, me and him, always needing to anchor fabric to something solid so it wouldn't collapse. And later I realized that what he was anchoring now was me, and the fabric was a narrative, and the solid thing was the eyes of other people who would witness the shape without touching the stakes. That afternoon, he stood with the neighbor's boy, the one who mows lawns for cash, and gestured toward our yard while talking too loudly. And I heard him say words like sun therapy and routine and doctor. And I understood I was being translated in a language that made me easier to manage. And I wanted to shout across the hedge that I was fluent in myself, that I did not need interpreting. But the boy waved and left, and in his absence the grass seemed to lie flatter, like it had surrendered. When the home visitor returned, kind eyes, clipboard, the smell of dry shampoo and long days, she asked if I would consider adult day programs, a phrase that sounds like safe harbor and feels like a docking fee. And I asked who had suggested it, and she glanced toward Evan's empty chair and said something about community resources. And I learned that there is a bureaucracy dedicated to turning a person's life into a case number, and that once a file is opened, it never really closes. It just waits for more pages. And on those pages, stories are written in passive voice. Services were offered, concerns were noted, follow-up was recommended, so that no one has to say who failed whom. I told her my mind was fine, that my wrists were sore for a very specific reason that had nothing to do with age, and she wrote it down, but her pen hesitated. And when pens hesitate, the truth becomes optional, and I watched her switch to softer questions about meals and hygiene and social contact, all the measures used to calculate a life's worthiness for intervention. And I wanted to ask, where on her form is the box for she raised a son who broke and a grandson who is breaking, and none of this is contagious, but everyone treats it like it is. But I only said I could use help with the gutters and a ride to the bank, and she smiled as if I had finally spoken her language and promised a list of numbers. I began waking before the sun, the way I did when my son was a baby, and the house needed quiet courage to survive the day. I sat at the table with my hands around a mug I rarely drank. I rehearsed sentences that began with no and ended with not anymore. And after breakfast, I swallowed them with my vitamins. I told myself that kindness without boundaries is just a gamble against despair, and I had already lost too many bets. I wrote down the bank's hours, the lawyer's name a neighbor once whispered to me after a funeral, the number for a women's center that did not ask for age before offering appointments, and I hid the list where I used to keep Christmas gifts, under a stack of recipe cards that smell like cinnamon and apologies, and every time I passed that drawer, I felt a small pulse of defiance, like a second heartbeat forming. Evan felt it too, I think, because control has a nose, and he started asking where I was going, even before I stood, started following my movements with that slick casualness of a cat pretending it doesn't care which door you choose, started saying we when he meant you, as in, we don't need to talk to outsiders. We are doing fine. We can handle it. And I realized that in this grammar, we is a leash. So when the day came, the day he decided fresh air required restraints and that my compliance needed an audience, it did not arrive as a shock or a storm. It arrived like a continuation of a sentence he had been writing for weeks, a sentence I kept trying to interrupt with commas of reason and semicolons of history, and he erased punctuation until only his momentum remained. And that is what I mean when I say escalation is quiet. It does not announce itself. It edits you. And when you finally read aloud what's left, you do not recognize your voice, only the ache in your throat where all the unsentences live. The first morning I woke in the hospital, I mistook the hum of the fluorescent light for the buzz of the bees that used to nest near the pear tree. The ceiling above me was a flat white, too bright to belong to any mercy, and the sheet across my chest was tucked so tight it felt like a verdict. A nurse, with a voice like cool water, said my name twice before I remembered to answer. They had given me fluids, antibiotics for the rope burns, and something mild for sleep, but I hadn't slept. I had drifted in a shallow fever of recollection where every sound was Evan's footsteps and every shadow the outline of a chair. I wanted to ask how long I had been there, but the nurse, whose badge read Gloria, said gently, 2 days, sweetheart. You're safe now. Safe is a word that bruises when it lands too soon. I nodded, though I felt more like an object retrieved than a person rescued, and when she left, the room expanded around me, filled with the echo of absence, the same echo that had followed me since the night the police lights swept across my walls and turned my life into evidence. They brought me oatmeal on a tray, and the first spoonful tasted like dust. The doctor said I could go home in a day or two if there was someone to care for me. I almost laughed at that. Evan had been arrested. The neighbors were too polite to intrude, and the only family I had left was a brother in Florida who sent Christmas cards without signatures. I told the doctor I'd manage. He smiled, the way men in white coats do when they know bureaucracy will make the decision for them. A social worker came in that afternoon, young enough to be my granddaughter, her hair in a careless knot, her tone both soft and procedural. She asked about my finances, about power of attorney, about whether I felt safe returning home. She said the words temporary guardianship and assisted living, and I realized that rescue can also be another form of removal, that in the language of care, every synonym for safety means someone else holds the key. I told her I wanted to go home to feed the cat, even though the cat had been gone for years. It was the only excuse that still made me sound like I belonged somewhere. When they discharged me, I stepped into sunlight that felt wrong, too pure for what had happened. A volunteer wheeled me to the curb where a van waited to take me home, though I wasn't sure which home they meant. The driver spoke little English, but his silence was kind. As the streets rolled past, I watched people walk their dogs, carry groceries, wave to each other. The world hadn't paused for me. It never does. The house looked smaller when I saw it again. The paint on the shutters chipped, the yard littered with caution tape that flapped like defeated flags. Inside, everything smelled of disinfectant and disuse. The chair was gone. The police had taken it as evidence. I should have been grateful, but its absence was worse than its presence. It left an indentation in the air, a shape where meaning used to be. I sat on the couch, wrapped in a borrowed sweater, and waited for the silence to say something. The first few days passed like fog. Calls from numbers I didn't know, messages from voices I didn't trust. News vans had parked down the street. The story had made the local channel under the title, Elder Abuse Shocks Quiet Neighborhood. I saw my own porch on television, the caption beneath it, Victim Recovering. They used a picture from my old driver's license, the one where I still had color in my hair, and I thought, she doesn't know yet, that woman. She's still waiting for the world to make sense. The reporter interviewed a neighbor who said, "We always thought they were such a nice family." That sentence is the national anthem of denial. Another neighbor claimed she heard me screaming, but thought it was the television. I turned off the screen and sat in the dark until the only sound left was my own breathing. It was during those nights that the shift began. At first it was small, like the click of a lock turning from inside. I realized no one was coming to save me because no one had truly tried before. Everything that had happened, Evan's control, my silence, the slow erosion of my choices, was just an extension of a life spent apologizing for existing. I had built a habit of patience so heavy it bent my spine. But sitting there in the half-light of a house that finally admitted its loneliness, I felt the first tremor of something unfamiliar. Not anger exactly, but refusal. A clear, steady refusal to vanish quietly. The next morning I dressed carefully, as if for work. My body was stiff, my wrists bandaged, but I moved with the determination of someone returning to a country she once ruled. I walked to the kitchen, opened drawers, took inventory of what was missing. My wallet, half my mail, the spare keys, gone. My checkbook lay open on the table with pages torn out. I found one of Evan's hoodies crumpled near the door, smelled the sweat and cheap detergent, and felt that strange mixture of love and disgust that only family can produce. I sat at the table and began to write. Not a letter, not a complaint, but a record. I listed dates, conversations, withdrawals, the names of anyone who might remember seeing us together. The act of writing steadied me. It was as if language itself could sew the torn edges of my life. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the paper was full, until the fear began to lose its shape. In the afternoon, I went outside for the first time since the incident. The sun was gentler, filtered through the gray of early spring. The neighbors watched from their porches, pretending not to. I nodded at them. They nodded back, relief and discomfort sharing the same polite smile. Across the street, a woman I used to trade magazines with brought me a covered dish. "I didn't know what you liked," she said, and I wanted to tell her I used to like being seen. Instead, I thanked her and carried it inside. That night, I ate alone, every bite a small act of reclamation. The social worker returned 2 days later with pamphlets about support groups and victim assistance funds. Her voice had the practiced empathy of someone trained to stay afloat in other people's suffering. She asked if I'd thought about therapy. I told her I'd started already, though not the kind she meant. I was cleaning the house, each drawer, each shelf, sorting what stayed and what left. I threw away old clothes, ripped photographs, broken trinkets that once meant love, but now only echoed debt. Healing is sometimes just heavy lifting with better motives. She smiled, wrote something in her folder, and before leaving she said softly, "You're stronger than you think." I didn't answer, because strength is not a compliment. It's the tax we pay for surviving. That evening, I walked to the edge of the yard where the chair had stood. The grass there was still flattened in a perfect square. I stared at it until the light shifted, and it seemed to rise again, phantom-like, daring me to remember. I whispered, "You don't own me anymore," and for the first time, my voice didn't tremble. I went inside, locked the door, and opened the drawer where I had hidden my list. On top of it, I placed a single sheet of paper that said, in large letters, "I am my own witness." I didn't know what I would do with it yet, but it felt like the beginning of a map. That night, sleep came slowly, but it came. I dreamed of Derek sitting on the porch, carving a piece of wood, the smell of pears heavy in the air. He looked up at me and said, "You've been quiet too long." When I woke, the house was still dark, but the silence had changed texture. It no longer pressed. It waited. I boiled water, made coffee, opened the window. The world outside was cool and ordinary, and I understood that ordinary was what I had been starving for. I didn't need heroism. I needed mornings that didn't begin with fear. I called the police station to ask about the case, and they told me Evan was still in custody pending evaluation. The word evaluation lingered in the air like a question no one wants to answer. I thanked them and hung up. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from decision. I opened the phone book, an old habit that made me feel steadier, and found the number of a lawyer who handled elder financial abuse cases. The woman who answered sounded bored until I mentioned the arrest. Then her voice sharpened. She told me to bring any documents I had. I said I would. After hanging up, I realized I hadn't left the house since the hospital, and the idea of stepping into public air filled me with both dread and anticipation. It would be a kind of resurrection. The next morning I dressed again with care. Navy skirt, pressed blouse, coat that still smelled faintly of smoke. I brushed my hair, applied lipstick for the first time in months, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back was older, thinner, but her eyes were alive. I whispered, "Don't flinch," and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the world indifferent, and that indifference was freedom. Each step toward the bus stop felt like reclaiming a piece of ground I'd ceded without realizing it. People glanced, some recognizing me from the news, others not at all. Both reactions were blessings. On the ride downtown, I watched the city through the window, the rows of houses, the small dramas of other lives unfolding. I thought about all the women sitting in their own quiet prisons, chairs that looked like marriages, obligations, or misplaced guilt. I wanted to tell them that no one hands you escape. You build it out of decisions no one applauds. The bus stopped near the courthouse, and I stood, steadied myself, and stepped into the crowd. For the first time in years, I felt anonymous. It was beautiful. When I reached the lawyer's office, I realized the shift was complete. The world had not changed, but I had moved within it differently. I was no longer waiting to be believed. I was documenting truth, no longer hoping to be rescued. I was learning to defend. Sitting across from that woman with her folders and questions, I told my story, not the version that fits headlines, but the one that begins quietly, with love mistaken for debt and patience mistaken for virtue. When I finished, she said, "We'll take care of this." I smiled faintly. "No," I said, "I will." As I left her office and stepped into the afternoon, the sunlight caught on the windows of passing cars, and for a moment the whole street glimmered. I walked slower, letting the light follow. Somewhere behind me, the courthouse clock struck 3. It sounded like a beginning disguised as an ending, and I thought, yes, this is the midpoint, not of pain, but of return. The part of the story where a woman stops being scenery and becomes the voice again. The world didn't bow or notice. It simply made space for me to keep walking, and that was enough. Before the trial, there was the waiting, and waiting has a temperature. It sits somewhere between fever and frost, a restlessness that crawls under your ribs until every breath feels borrowed. They told me the court would take months, that investigations require time, that paperwork must circulate like blood before justice can be pronounced. Time, they said, as if it were medicine. But time is not medicine when you live alone in a house that still smells like betrayal, when every creak of wood sounds like footsteps returning, when each envelope in the mailbox could contain either a bill or a threat. The world went quiet around me in those weeks after the lawyer filed the papers. The neighbors who had once waved now nodded with awkward sympathy, uncertain if they were supposed to treat me as survivor or scandal. The news crews had gone, the yellow tape was gone, but the shadow of that night stayed printed on the grass like a watermark. In the mornings, I forced myself into small routines. I swept the porch, boiled water, opened the curtains, each motion an act of reclaiming the ordinary. Yet each day brought a new reminder of how thoroughly Evan had rearranged my life. Letters from the bank listing overdrafts I had not made, calls from agencies asking about payments I never approved. He had threaded himself into my existence so completely that even in his absence I tripped over him. I found his handwriting in the margins of my notebooks, little notes to himself, numbers, half-finished drawings, fragments of sentences I couldn't decipher. I began to wonder if he had been planning this for longer than I realized, or if it had grown naturally, like mold in a place too long sealed from air. I tried to hate him cleanly, but hatred is a tangle. Every root of anger runs through the soil of love, and when you try to pull one, you disturb the other. The lawyer called me to prepare a statement. She said my testimony would matter, that I had to be precise, factual, restrained. Juries like control, she said. I practiced in front of the mirror, repeating dates and phrases until they lost meaning, but when I reached the sentence about the rope, my throat closed. I imagined sitting in a courtroom, strangers staring, and my voice collapsing into silence again. I needed to reclaim that voice before the trial, or it would die on the stand. That realization pushed me towards something reckless. One afternoon, after weeks of staying within the safety of daylight, I took the bus to the county jail. I told myself I only wanted to see him, to prove to myself that he existed beyond the nightmare, but there was more to it. Some part of me still needed to understand. The officer at the desk looked surprised when I gave my name. He asked if I was sure. I said yes. The waiting area smelled of disinfectant and coffee that had surrendered hours ago. When they finally led me into the visitation room, the glass separated us like another kind of rope. Evan looked older, or maybe smaller. His hair was longer, his face unshaven, his eyes unfocused. He lifted the phone slowly. "Grandma," he said, and the word cracked between us. I waited, watching his fingers twitch. "They said you pressed charges," he murmured. "You didn't have to do that. I was sick." I wanted to ask what sickness ties another human being to a chair, but instead I said, "You could have asked for help." He laughed, a dry, broken laugh that made me think of my son, his father, in the last days before the overdose, how he'd laughed the same way when I begged him to stay. "You wouldn't understand," Evan said. "You never do. You think love fixes everything." I felt the anger rise, but forced it down. "Love doesn't fix," I said quietly. "It witnesses." He shook his head, eyes shining with something I couldn't name. "You just don't want to admit you made me this way." That sentence sliced through the glass cleaner than any blade. I realized he believed it. In his mind, I was the architect of his ruin, the source of every failure. I had fed him, sheltered him, saved him too many times, and he had mistaken that mercy for control. I hung up the phone. The officer gestured toward the exit. As I walked away, I heard Evan shout, muffled through the barrier, "You'll be sorry when they find out what you did." I didn't turn back. That night I couldn't sleep. His words replayed, twisting themselves into new shapes. What if he meant to hurt me again? What if he still had allies outside, friends who believed his version? The lawyer warned me that defendants sometimes reach out through others. I checked the locks twice, then 3 times. Still the noises persisted, the wind, the memory, the ghosts of footsteps. Sometime near dawn I sat by the window, watching the pear tree. Its branches, bare all winter, trembled under the first hints of bud. Life, stubborn as ever. I whispered to the dark, "Not yet." The next week, letters began arriving. They weren't signed, but the handwriting was his. The first said, "You ruined everything." The second, "Everyone knows what you did." The third, a single phrase, "You should have died that night." I brought them to the lawyer. She called the prosecutor. They traced the letters back to a fellow inmate who claimed Evan dictated them. The prosecutor assured me it would strengthen the case, but reassurance is a weak currency. Each envelope felt like a small burial. I started leaving lights on at night. I kept the radio playing softly, the human voices proof that I was still here. Then came the reporters again. The trial date had been announced, and someone leaked my name. They called during dinner, during sleep, questions spilling through static. Did I forgive him? Did I fear him? Did I think addiction was to blame? I hung up each time, but their persistence turned the house into a stage again. Neighbors peeked over fences, pretending concern. One afternoon, a woman I didn't recognize knocked and asked if I'd like to appear on a survivors panel. I shut the door gently, because fury at my age is no longer loud. It's surgical. The tension built quietly. Court papers piled on the table, each stamped with dates that felt like warnings. I spent hours rehearsing my testimony with the lawyer, but the real rehearsal happened alone, late at night, when I whispered into the air the words I wished I could say, that love is not a cure, that pity is another form of control, that forgiveness is not owed. I promised myself that when the time came, I would tell the truth, not the tidy version they wanted, but the raw one, the truth that starts with, "I allowed it," and ends with, "never again." The morning of the pre-trial hearing, I dressed in the same navy skirt I had worn to the lawyer's office. As I buttoned my blouse, I noticed my hands didn't shake. The courthouse smelled of coffee and floor polish, the way all institutions do when they want to seem clean. The prosecutor nodded to me. The defense lawyer avoided my eyes. Evan entered escorted by 2 guards. He wore a plain shirt, hair trimmed, face empty. When he saw me, he smirked, small, practiced, poisonous. It was the same smirk he used as a child when he broke something valuable and waited for me to clean it up. But I didn't look away. For the first time, he did. After the hearing, the lawyer said we had a strong case. I nodded, but strength felt like something that lived in other people's mouths. That night, I dreamt of Derek again, this time younger, in his workshop, sanding a chair leg smooth. He looked up and said, "You're almost there." And I woke with tears I didn't know I still had. As the trial approached, the world around me seemed to tighten. A vandal spray-painted the word liar on my fence. The police documented it, promised to increase patrols, which meant they'd drive by once at midnight. I scrubbed the paint off myself, the smell of solvent stinging my throat. My body ached for days afterward, but the fence stood clean. The act of erasing the word felt like reclaiming skin. A week later, the pear tree bloomed for the first time in 5 years, white flowers trembling against a gray sky. I took that as an omen. The day before the trial, I received one more letter, this one official. It was from Evan's public defender. Inside was a statement. He intended to plead not guilty by reason of diminished capacity. Attached was a note written in his own hand. "You'll see I was right. They'll believe me." The arrogance was familiar, almost comforting. It told me who he still was. I burned the note in the sink, watched the smoke curl upward, and felt lighter. The courtroom was colder than I expected. They called my name, and I walked to the stand. The oath felt heavier than any prayer I'd ever spoken. I began slowly, describing the small details, the sound of the rope tightening, the neighbor's silence, the feel of the sun on my skin. The prosecutor wanted facts. I gave her truths. When I finished, the room was quiet. Evan stared at the floor. The defense tried to paint him as broken, as misunderstood. I didn't argue. I only said, broken things can still choose where to fall. During cross-examination, he looked up once, his eyes wet, and for a moment I saw the boy who had once cried over a dead bird. But pity is a dangerous inheritance. I let it pass through me and out. The judge called for recess, and as I left the stand, I felt something uncoil in my chest. It was not joy, not relief, just space where fear had lived too long. That evening, the news aired footage from the courthouse. They used my testimony, the headline dramatic, "Grandmother faces her abuser." I turned off the television and sat in the quiet, the pear blossoms visible through the window, glowing pale in the moonlight. I realized the story no longer belonged to them, not even to the court. It belonged to me. Weeks later, the verdict came, guilty on all counts, 5 years with mandatory treatment. The sentence was less than I expected, more than he deserved. When the judge read it aloud, Evan didn't react. I sat perfectly still, not from serenity, but from exhaustion. Survival, I learned, is not triumph, it's maintenance. After the hearing, reporters crowded near, microphones outstretched. "Do you forgive him?" one asked. I looked at her, at the world reflected in her lens, and said, "That's not my job anymore." Then I walked away. At home, I opened the window and let the air in. The chair was gone, the ropes burned, the yard quiet. I stood there for a long time, breathing. The news that night showed Evan being led away, handcuffed, face blank. The caption said, "Justice served." I didn't watch the rest. Justice is not something you watch. It's something you learn to live beside, like a neighbor with whom you no longer speak, but still share a fence. The next morning, I planted new grass where the evidence tape had once fluttered. My hands shook from effort, but I kept going. I thought about how endings rarely announce themselves. They whisper. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. Not for me, not anymore. I pressed the soil flat, felt the pulse of the earth, and whispered, grow. It was not forgiveness. It was continuation, and that, I decided, was enough. The climax came not in the courtroom nor in the verdict, but in the days that followed, in the quiet aftermath when the noise of justice faded and life returned to its deceptive rhythm. For a while I drifted, suspended between exhaustion and clarity, uncertain whether I had reached an ending or merely another form of captivity. The newspapers moved on to newer tragedies. The neighbors stopped whispering. The phone stopped ringing, and I was left alone with my house, my name, and the hollow echo of all that had been said. The silence was supposed to feel like peace, but at first it felt like aftermath, like standing on a shore littered with debris after a storm, unsure which pieces still belonged to you. I told myself I was free now, yet freedom without direction is just disorientation wearing nicer clothes. I cleaned, rearranged, opened windows, let light in, but light also exposes dust, and I had plenty of that. One afternoon in early summer, as the air thickened with the smell of rain and cut grass, I received a letter from the Department of Corrections. It was formal, impersonal, printed on cheap gray paper. It informed me that Evan had been transferred to a rehabilitation facility and that as a registered victim, I could choose to receive updates about his progress. At the bottom, there was a checkbox for, yes, I wish to be informed, and another for, no, I do not. I sat at the table with the paper before me, my pen poised over indecision. The idea of knowing every step of his so-called recovery felt like reopening the wound each time, yet the idea of ignorance was worse. I ticked yes. Knowledge, even painful, is still a kind of power. That night it rained heavily, the kind of rain that fills gutters and pounds roofs until the whole world sounds like a drum. I made tea, sat by the window, and watched the pear tree sway under the downpour. It was heavy with fruit for the first time since Derek died. The branches bent, but didn't break, and I saw myself in that stubborn curve. Something in me tightened, a decision forming not in my mind, but deeper, in the marrow of me. I realized I had been living defensively, guarding my life like a secret, when what I needed was to rewrite it as a statement. The trial had ended, yes, but the narrative still belonged to those who framed it, prosecutors, reporters, strangers. I wanted to reclaim authorship. The next morning, I opened a drawer and pulled out my old typewriter, the one I had used decades ago for lesson plans and letters to parents. I cleaned the dust from its keys, rolled in a sheet of paper, and began to type. Not a diary, not a confession, but a record, a reclamation. I wrote the truth as I had lived it, unembellished and unsoftened. I wrote about the gradual suffocation of love when it turns into obligation, about the erosion of selfhood in the name of family, about how kindness without boundaries curdles into servitude. I wrote until my fingers cramped, until my back ached, until the room filled with the smell of metal and ink. Each page was a defiance against the silence that had defined me. When I finished, I had a stack of 50 pages. I read them aloud to the empty house. My voice trembled at first, then grew steady. I imagined Derek sitting in his chair, listening. I imagined every woman who had been told to endure, every grandmother labeled frail, every survivor who had been thanked for her strength instead of freed from her pain. I felt them gather around me, invisible but present. That night, for the first time since the rope, I slept without dreams. A week later, The lawyer called to say the court required my signature on final documents. I went downtown, signed my name again and again until it became abstract, just loops of ink. On my way back, I passed a small community center with a notice board outside. One of the flyers caught my eye. Story Circle for Women, 60 plus. Share your voice, no judgment. I stood there for a long moment, the paper fluttering in the breeze like an invitation. I tore off one of the tabs with the phone number and tucked it into my coat pocket. That night I called. A cheerful voice answered, told me meetings were every Thursday. "You can come and just listen if you like," she said. I almost said no out of habit, then heard myself say yes. The first evening I went, I almost turned back at the door. The room smelled of coffee and perfume, the kind older women wear, sweet and defiant. There were 8 of us sitting in a circle, each holding a small object that represented our story, a photograph, a key, a ribbon. I had brought nothing. When it was my turn, I hesitated. The woman next to me, with kind eyes and a trembling hand, said softly, "Take your time." So I did. I began speaking, haltingly at first, then with growing momentum, the words tumbling out as if they had been waiting their whole lives behind my teeth. I told them everything: the chair, the neighbors, the fear, the trial, the way silence can be a second form of violence. No one interrupted. No one asked for proof. When I finished, they were crying, but it wasn't pity. It was recognition. One woman reached out and took my hand, her grip strong. "You survived," she said. "Now teach us how." That night, walking home under the orange glow of the street lamps, I felt lighter, though the world itself hadn't changed. The house greeted me with its usual creaks, but they no longer sounded ominous. They sounded alive. I made tea again, sat by the window, and reread the letter from the department. There was a new update attached. Evan had completed his first month of treatment. He was showing signs of progress. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a box with the others. I didn't know if progress was real, but I knew it was no longer my responsibility to measure it. A few weeks later, a journalist contacted me, asking if I'd be willing to speak publicly about elder abuse. She said the network was doing a special, that my story could help others. For a moment, I hesitated. Hadn't I spent years being turned into a story for other people's consumption? But then I thought of the women in the circle, of how power multiplies when shared. I agreed on one condition, that they film it in my yard, in the exact spot where everything had happened. The producer paused, then said yes. The morning of the interview, I wore a simple gray dress and pinned my hair back. When the crew arrived, the sky was pale, the air warm. They set up cameras, microphones, cables. The young reporter asked if I wanted to rehearse. I said no. When the red light came on, I looked straight into the lens and spoke, not to the audience, but to myself, to the woman I had been tied to that chair, to the girl I once was, to the generations who might hear echoes of their own silencing in my words. I told them that survival is not the end of violence, but the continuation of life despite it, that forgiveness is not required for freedom, that silence serves only those who benefit from it. I spoke without notes, without hesitation. When I finished, the crew was quiet. The reporter whispered, "That was raw." I smiled. "Real," I corrected. They packed up and left, and I stayed in the yard. The sun was setting, the light turning gold. I looked at the pear tree again, its branches heavy with fruit, the air humming with insects. The chair was gone, but its ghost lingered faintly in the grass, like a shadow that had forgotten its source. I walked to that spot and stood there, feeling the ground firm beneath my feet. Then, on impulse, I went to the garage and pulled out Derek's old gardening shears. I returned to the tree and began trimming the branches, cutting away the dead wood. Each snip was deliberate, rhythmic, almost ceremonial, the air filled with the scent of sap and renewal. When I was done, I gathered the cut branches into a pile, struck a match, and set them alight. The fire burned small but steady, the smoke rising into the twilight. I watched it until the flames softened to embers. My hands smelled of earth and smoke, my heart of relief. This was my act of closure, not the trial, not the cameras, but this quiet burning. I realized that for years I had been pruning myself, cutting away parts to make room for others, to make love less heavy for them. But now the cutting was for me, a reclamation of growth, a promise that I would bloom again on my own terms. As the last ember died, I whispered a single sentence to the dark. You don't own me anymore. It wasn't addressed to Evan, or to the past, or even to fate. It was for every part of me that had ever mistaken endurance for love. I turned, went inside, washed my hands, and watched the soot swirl down the drain. The sky outside was clear again, the stars steady. I brewed one last cup of tea, sat by the window, and exhaled. The rope had long been gone, but only now did I feel its weight truly lift. In that moment, I understood the word climax differently. It wasn't about confrontation or revenge. It was about the quiet reclamation of one's narrative. The moment a voice once buried under years of politeness rises and fills the room, steady and certain. I had no audience now, no judge, no camera. Only the sound of the rain returning faintly in the distance, the pear tree alive outside, and my own breath, even and calm. I whispered, I am here, and for the first time in my long, fractured life, that was enough. When autumn arrived, the world quieted into gold and dust, and for the first time in years, the season did not feel like an ending, but a settling. The pear tree outside my window had already dropped most of its fruit, each one small and misshapen, but alive, proof that something could still grow out of neglect. I gathered them in a bowl on the table, not to eat, but to remember. The smell of them filled the house, a faint sweetness that seemed to forgive without words. It had been 6 months since the trial, and life, stubborn and ordinary, had taken root again. The reporters stopped calling, the social workers stopped visiting, and the lawyer sent a final letter marked, Case Closed. I read it once, then tucked it in a drawer with the rest of the papers, that small archive of survival that no one but me would ever fully understand. The silence afterward was not empty. It was earned. In those quiet months, I learned how to live without the constant rehearsal of fear. I walked to the market again, carrying my canvas bag like I used to, greeting the same shopkeepers who now met my eyes with cautious kindness. I began tending the garden, pruning what could still be saved, planting bulbs that would bloom next spring if the soil forgave me. There was a rhythm to it: water, wait, watch. I took comfort in things that didn't ask questions: soap bubbles, rising dough, the scrape of a chair across a clean floor. I even fixed Derek's old clock, the one that had stopped ticking the night Evan was arrested. Its hands now moved steadily again, and each tick felt like an apology accepted by time itself. Every few weeks, an envelope from the Department of Corrections arrived, neutral and precise. Evan had completed another phase of treatment, had joined a vocational program, had written an apology letter the facility was required to forward. The first one arrived in November. It was short, handwritten in a script I had once helped him perfect when he was 7 and learning to write thank you cards for Christmas gifts. The letter began with, I don't expect you to read this, and ended with, I think I understand now. There was no I'm sorry. There was no request for forgiveness. It was a fragment of recognition, clumsy and unfinished, but it was enough to tell me that something in him had shifted. I folded it carefully and placed it in a box with the rest, not because I forgave him, but because I refused to let hate take up any more space in my house. Hatred, I had learned, is another kind of rope, and I was done with ropes. I began attending the story circle every Thursday, sometimes speaking, sometimes just listening. The women there became a quiet sisterhood, each carrying her own invisible history. We didn't fix each other, we bore witness. There was something sacred in that kind of attention, a recognition that survival is communal even when healing is private. One evening, after I read a passage from the pages I had typed that summer, a woman across the room, small, bird-boned, with trembling hands, whispered, "You said what I've never dared to say." That night I walked home lighter, the air crisp, the moon low and calm. It struck me then that my voice, once a weapon turned inward, had become a bridge. As winter crept in, I found myself drawn to small acts of defiance disguised as tenderness. I painted the shutters a deep blue like the sky before rain, bought new curtains, mended the tear in my favorite dress. I started volunteering at the library, reading aloud to children whose parents worked late. Their laughter, unfiltered and bright, filled the room like something holy. Sometimes I caught myself watching them and wondering if, long ago, I had ever looked at Evan that way, without fear, without the shadow of what was to come. Regret visits quietly. It no longer punishes, it instructs. I learned to let it sit beside me without taking my plate. The town eventually forgot the scandal. The neighbors spoke to me again, cautiously at first, then with genuine warmth. The same man who had once filmed my humiliation now nodded respectfully when we met by the mailbox. I didn't resent him. He had been a mirror for the times we lived in, where witnessing pain felt safer than preventing it. Sometimes, when the evening air turned cold, I imagined those same neighbors looking out their windows and seeing me walking calmly down the street, and I hoped they understood that what they were watching was not pity or recovery, but return, the slow reclamation of an ordinary woman's life. One afternoon, while sorting through drawers, I found the paper I had written months ago with the words, "I am my own witness." The ink had faded slightly, but the certainty remained. I pinned it to the wall above the kitchen table, beside a photograph of Derek smiling under the pear tree. Beneath it, I wrote in smaller letters, "And I am not alone." The next day, I mailed copies of my story to 3 community newsletters, the kind printed on cheap paper and distributed for free. I didn't expect publication, but one of them wrote back, asking if I would allow an excerpt. I said yes. A month later, my words appeared in the corner of page 7, under a modest heading, "On Endurance." I read it over breakfast and felt nothing grand, just a quiet recognition that my voice now lived outside my body, free to find whoever might need it. When spring returned, the pear tree bloomed again, fuller than I remembered. The blossoms opened early, reckless with life. I sat beneath it one morning, the air soft and full of bees, and realized that my story had stopped asking for closure. It simply wanted to be lived. The house behind me was still old, the world still imperfect, and loneliness still visited from time to time, but it no longer frightened me. Loneliness, when met with peace, becomes solitude, and solitude, when chosen, becomes a home. Sometimes women from the story circle call me when they feel the edges of their courage fray. I listen the way they once listened to me, and when words fail, I remind them of the same truth I had to learn the hardest way, that silence protects no one, that surviving is not a shameful act of endurance, but a creative one, the rebuilding of self from ruins. When I hang up, I return to my garden, to the slow and patient work of pruning and planting, the work that teaches the same lesson over and over, that decay feeds growth, that nothing truly ends, that beauty often blooms out of what was once unbearable. I am 73 now. The scars on my wrists have faded into pale rings, delicate as bracelets, reminders not of captivity, but of the body's stubborn will to heal. I live quietly, I sleep well, and sometimes, in the late evening, when the wind moves through the trees, I swear I hear Derek's voice again, soft, approving, as if to say, "You've come home," and I have. Not to the house, though it stands around me, but to myself, to the woman I was, before fear, before apology, before endurance became my native tongue. If another woman were to ask me what freedom feels like at my age, I would tell her it feels like breathing without permission, like waking without dread, like holding your own hand and finding it steady. I would tell her that forgiveness, if it ever comes, will not look like surrender, but like stillness, the kind that follows a storm. And I would tell her that healing is not a return to who you were, but a quiet claiming of who you have become. Then I would hand her one of the small pears from the bowl on my table, bruised but sweet, and say, "Here, taste this. It's not perfect, but it's real." And that would be the end of my story, or perhaps its true beginning.